Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for the hunt for the X-15 rocket plane. From 1959 to 1968, NASA operated 3 North American aviation rocket planes to great effect. In 199 flights, they generated over 700 technical papers on aerodynamics and set altitude and speed records for winged vehicles not exceeded until the space shuttle many years later. In 1993, so that's like 30 years ago, our presenter, David Ball, organized a search in the Mojave Desert for parts from the X-15 number 3, which came apart in flight back in 1967. Today, he will share what made the X-15 the greatest research plane ever built, as well as his theory on why one of them was lost. And so, as I said, David Ball is the presenter today. He's a volunteer educator with NASA. As a solar system ambassador with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, he presents topics related to American activities in space. Whew. So all of us, let's give a big virtual round of applause to David for joining us this afternoon on this 80-degree day. And David, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
The energy with that, I mean, you could get to orbit from Robert's energy. Thank you so much. It's a delight to be with you again. I love the work that Robert does in organizing these events, and we always get wonderful participation. Hopefully, my dad is out there in the audience. He helped us on this trip 30 years ago, and hopefully this will bring back some memories for him. I wanted to share with you a letter that I wrote 30 years ago. Dear Mr. Thompson, last month you were gracious to send me an inscribed copy of At the Edge of Space. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you. Crossfield's Always Another Dawn and Bergman's 90 Seconds to Space were both very different. Crossfield told his story and not of the X-15, and while Bergman's work was excellent, it was written in 1960, hardly the best perspective on the X-15 program. I was born in 1959 and grew up playing with a model of the X-15. I was, and still am, fascinated by it. As a student of aviation history, I regard the X-15 as the finest research aircraft to ever fly. I might even make the case that the plane is the finest experimental aircraft that will ever take to the air. As a member of Civil Air Patrol, a volunteer auxiliary of the Air Force, I have, over the past 10 years, conducted numerous searches for missing aircraft. I'd like to investigate an adventure of a lifetime. You could help by putting me in touch with those who can assess the feasibility of that endeavor. With a small group of searchers, I'd like to come to Edwards and get a short tour of Dryden and perhaps briefly meet you. Then we'd proceed to Johannesburg to see if we could find any remaining evidence of the number 3 aircraft. I know the large significant pieces were recovered in 1967, but to me, finding a few fragments of the plane that hold the absolute world altitude record would be like recovering fabric from the Wright Flyer. This idea may sound silly or perhaps fantastic, but to me, it's an adventure. To visit Edwards and Dryden, I've already seen the aircraft in Washington and Dayton. To meet you and to research a mystery 25 years old would be exciting. Just to correspond with those involved in the program and pore over old records and topographical maps would be great fun. In 1905, Scientific American continued to deny that the Wrights had successfully flown. Someday, the world outside of the aviation community will recognize the significance of the North American rocket plane. Would that I had planned an adventure at the turn of the century looking for scraps of fabric near Kill Devil Hills. I recognize how this adventure seems. The same was said to Robert Ballard in his quest for the Titanic, or to Taylor and Epps in their effort to locate and free the lost squadron of P-38s from the ice in Greenland. You're a busy guy, and I appreciate that. The demands on your time are those of present-day concerns. Consider for a moment a young boy, now 33, who used to follow your adventures and would like to spend his 2-week vacation having an adventure of his own. Will you help? You know, as soon as I wrote that letter and put it in the mail, I regretted it. It sounded so childish. But a week later, I get a handwritten note from NASA. David, I appreciate your interest in the X-15 and your desire to search for some pieces or parts of the No. 3 aircraft. We may be able to help and offer you some assistance. I talked to Al Harris, the chief of our avionics construction and repair section, and one of our special hosts for VIPs. He indicated an interest in supporting your search effort. Al was involved in the original search for parts and is an off-road enthusiast. I'd suggest you contact him to make arrangements for a visit to Dryden. I've given him a copy of your letter, and he's expecting you to contact him. Let me share with you right there. Okay. 3 aspects about the X-15. I want to share with you why it was an important plane and why I think it crashed, and tell you a little bit about our hunt for the X-15. So after World War II, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, which ended up becoming NASA, had a lot of capability in terms of wind tunnels and a lot of experienced engineers, and they were looking at aviation. And with the war completed, they were particularly interested in compressibility. The idea that if you flew a plane fast enough, the envelope of air that was surrounding the wings and the fuselage would get compressed, and the plane would be flying so fast that the air couldn't get out of the way. So theoretically, when you're flying fast enough, the air in front of the wings and the fuselage compresses, and it's almost like you're flying into a wall, sonic wall, at the speed of sound, Mach 1. So they created an aircraft, the Bell X-1, and flew it with the first liquid rocket engine to power it, and it broke the sound barrier in 1947. So here is showing the early rocket planes, the X-1, the X-2, the X-1A, and you can see what their high altitude marks, 70,000, 100,000, 125,000 feet, and how fast they were able to go. Just barely breaking Mach 1. The Navy plane, the D558 Mach 2, reached Mach 2 with Scott Crossfield, all the way up to Mel Apt in the X-2, reaching over 3 times the speed of sound. But if you compare those to the X-15 is off the charts. I mean, the speed, it went hypersonic. It was flying 5 times, 6, almost 7 times the speed of sound. And in terms of elevation, it flew so high that there was no atmosphere left. It was actually flying in space. 8 of the 12 guys that flew it had altitude flights where they received astronaut wings for flying this plane. That's why this plane was special. So in World War II, the Germans had a missile, the V2. It stood 46 feet tall. It weighed 29,000 pounds, and it had a massive engine that was able to take a 2,200-pound warhead and lob it 200 miles to hit London. So the engine developed 55,000 pounds of thrust, and it would burn for about a minute, and this thing was hypersonic. It would fly 5 times the speed of sound. It was an unbelievable power plant. Contrast that to this aircraft on the right. It has a length of 51 feet. It weighs about the same. Its engine is about the same. Its burn time, maybe burns a little bit longer. And so now you have someone, imagine you could put somebody in a V2 rocket that's flying hypersonic, 5 times the speed of sound, and yet it's controllable. And you can do experiments in it. And you have almost 200 flights over a span of almost 10 years. And you generate 700 reports out of it. It was phenomenal. It was like nothing else. And much of it really comes down to the power plant. So the original liquid rocket engine in the United States was developed by Robert Goddard. And he had some significant influence in the precursors to the XLR-11. So he designed a liquid rocket engine, and then reaction motors and Thiokol and Rockwell International. They were all kind of responsible for this rocket engine. So the XLR-11, which is a liquid propulsion rocket, had 4 chambers. And you could turn on and off the chambers to add additional thrust. Each chamber would give you 1,500 pounds of thrust, or together the XLR-11 developed 6,000 pounds of thrust. And at some point, they were able to kind of optimize that, and they put 2 of them in there. So you were getting 16,000 pounds of thrust, and you can see it in the back of the X-15 there on the left. And this was until the later part of 1960. This is what was powering the X-15. To give you an idea what happened when they moved to the big engine, the XLR-99, it had 1 chamber, and you could throttle it between 50% and 100%, and you could restart it in flight. And at 50%, it was generating 15,000 pounds of thrust, which was kind of the same as the optimized set of 2 XLR-11s. But when you opened this thing up, it was a beast. It developed 57,000 pounds of thrust, equivalent to like a V2 taking off. So its thrust to weight ratio, 62 to 1. The combustion chamber temperature, nearly 5,000 degrees. Imagine that you have to be able to cool a combustion chamber. It will keep the engine from melting because it's running at 5,000 degrees. And that's what they did in the X-15. So it's responsible for both altitude and speed records. On the right, you see the X-15 #2 with external tanks, and it's painted white. That's an ablative coating because the air is getting so hot around the aircraft that it'll actually burn like a blowtorch right through the plane. And it reached a top speed in October of 1967, where it was flying nearly 7 times the speed of sound. And had it not started to burn through the aircraft, they could have pushed it further. In terms of altitude, in addition to the speed runs, they did ballistic tests where you would launch from a B-52 and you'd point the nose up 40 degrees, light the engine, and it would run somewhere between a minute, minute and a half, and then you would continue this ballistic arc, and you'd be weightless at the top, not unlike the first Mercury flights in the space program. And then you'd come back, and with energy management, you would be able to bleed off your energy and come for a controlled landing on a runway. You could land on a runway. These guys would land on the dry lake bed, but they had that sort of precision. And as I said, 8 out of 12 of these guys got astronaut wings for flying this plane. To give you a sense, over on the right is a representation of the Mercury capsule for Alan Shepard. This is 1961, and these are the instruments that he's responsible for. On the left is the X-15, and this is about the same time. Now, with the X-15, they actually created a simulator. It's an analog simulator, but you can sit in it and you could be doing your missions and learning how to do things and seeing where the gauges were going and all that sort of thing. For the Mercury program, this representation that you see of the instruments, they had this glued on a piece of cardboard, and Alan Shepard was like pointing to pieces of it. So, I mean, they're both going into space, suborbital flight, but just to give you an idea of the complexity and in terms of the responsibilities of the X-15 pilot, you'll see phenomenally difficult and important. So we're 191 flights into 199. The first flight was in 1959, and this is 1967. And Joe Engle, who'd been flying the X-15, is now moving on to be an astronaut. And he ends up flying the space shuttle, by the way. And he said, coming back in the space shuttle, you could close your eyes and you were landing the X-15 again at Edwards. So he gets replaced by Major Mike Adams, who graduated #1 in test pilot school, very accomplished aviator. And the things that he's responsible for on this flight, in addition to piloting the plane, is they have a boost guidance experiment and solar spectrum and ultraviolet plume, and they're actually catching stardust, micrometeorite collection, wingtip deflection photography. They're testing some insulation for the Saturn V, because this is 1967. They're going to be launching people to the moon in the next year or two. And then they have this transverse probe experiment, which is going to end up being a problem, by the way. But so he goes into a hypersonic spin, recovers from that spin, but the plane breaks up, and you can see in the bottom there, that's the forward fuselage of what's left of the X-15 and the technicians who'd come out from the research facility. Over on the right, there's a gun camera that sits over the right shoulder of a pilot in experimental aircraft. And it takes motion pictures of what's going on the dashboard, so that you can see what the instruments look like at any particular time. Now, in this particular case with the crash, the plane broke apart, and as the plane was coming apart, the back of the gun camera came off, and the film canister came out, and you can see at the bottom, you can see light coming into the cockpit, and the film came out and got overexposed. So I had been involved in perhaps 50 missions to look for aircraft, and now most of these are Cessna 152, 177s, things like that, small planes, and sometimes they're ones that just didn't report in after their flight plan was done, or there was a storm and the ELT that was in the plane got rocked around by the winds and it went off, and then there was a beacon going off. But the Civil Air Patrol, which are a bunch of volunteers, an auxiliary of the Air Force, would be trained by the Coast Guard to conduct searches for aircraft. And I went through the Coast Guard class to be a mission coordinator, and I did that for a number of years. So I thought, well, wouldn't this be interesting? I'll take all the information that we know about this missing aircraft, plug it in, and we'll go and we'll do this hunt. So that's what I did. I put in what we knew about the pilot, what we knew about the weather conditions. And over on the left, I was working in the emergency room as a nurse in the hospital, and on their publication, they put a nice story there about me going, spending my vacation going out to California and looking for this plane. And over on the right, the Express, which is the magazine for NASA out at Dryden, put in a little article saying, hey, if you want to help, this guy from Civil Air Patrol wants to go out and see if he can find pieces of this plane. So I spent about 9 months preparing to go out there. And I worked with some archivists at the Air and Space Museum in Washington and got as much information as I could about the X-15, why it was successful, different elements about it, about the crash, what we knew. And so I drew up this image in the middle here, and it shows the flight path. And what the Coast Guard tells you is that if you're looking for an aircraft, 86% of the time, you're going to find it within half a mile left or right of whatever path it was supposed to be on. So we had radar altimetry that kind of told us where the plane was, and they found most of the big pieces. They found the forward fuselage, they found the engine, they found one of the wings. They found a lot of the stuff, but when this thing broke up, it scattered things to the wind. So there was still more stuff out there. So got my entourage together. Over on the left is my dad, who now lives in Canton, and on the right, my brother, who's an actor in Chicago. And they were like, yeah, we'll come out and help tromp around in the Mojave. And we did that, and we had a lot of fun. And so I broke the area up into search grids, and we had 2 teams that went out, and we ended up each team went out for 3 days, and I'll show you what we came up with. So we tried to photograph things as we found them, and also give you an idea of scale, and that's why it's got a credit card next to it. And I was unclear, because this has happened 25 years earlier. Was the stuff going to be buried? Was it going to be a lot of overgrowth? Would we recognize the stuff? So you could, for example, look at this structural bulkhead T. You can see a picture of what it looked like sitting there in the grass. And then below that, Dave Stoddard, who was with North American, is examining it. It's a piece of a bulkhead, and it's got the serial numbers of the aircraft on it. So it's clearly from this rocket plane, as opposed to being from some other plane or being something else. S over there in the middle, you can see that's the back of the gun camera. That's the piece that came off, and that's why the light came into that and ruined that film, and that was kind of interesting. Over on the left, the access panel, that's actually looking at the inside of the access panel, but that's what the exterior of the plane was. It was made out of Inconel X, which is a nickel alloy that is very similar to what they used on the Mercury spacecraft. And Zach, the kid grinning up on top, is the grandson of Dave Stoddard, who worked for North American, worked for NASA on the X-15 program. So the idea to take his grandson out on a hunt for the plane that his dad used to work on was exciting. And here's Zach finding a piece of the plane. And over on the right, you can see some of these stringers. These were used to reinforce the wing of the plane, and then the tubing that's going through it is a propellant that goes to the reaction control jets, because when you're flying in space, there's no air to bite with the wings, so you have to use little rocket jets to move around, and that's what that's about. So I decided that I wanted to try to write a report about what I think happened. Why did it crash? So I looked at the accident investigation report, and there were things that are known now, or were known in ’93, that weren't known in '67, and there were things that we found. So I wanted to kind of do my own take. So for me, I don't have a science background. I'm a retired nurse. But the one thing that I was able to bring to the table is the ability to search for missing aircraft. And that's something that I'd done for a while. And so that was my expertise. But obviously, to figure out what happened to this experimental aircraft, you need some very different people, some very technical kinds of people. So we were blessed to have Dave Stoddard, who was a propulsion technician. He'd worked for North American, transferred over to NASA, and he worked on the X-15. And we would be out in the desert, and you would think that the desert would be lifeless and sterile. It's anything but. There's all kinds of activity, animals, bugs, plants, and there's all kinds of junk. There are pieces of weather balloons. When people go off-roading or motorcycles, things like that, the fender will fall off, or there's all kinds of junk, man-made junk out in the Mojave. So we'd pick up some piece of tubing, and I wouldn't know if that's a weather balloon or it's something off of a car or if it's off of a plane. And if it's off of a plane, is it from our plane? Because there were a number of planes that crashed out there. But Stoddard, he could pick something up and he could tell you exactly what it was, what its composition was, what its use was, whether it was from our plane or not. Now, if it had a serial number, and some of them had serial numbers, I could say this is from this plane. But Stoddard, he knew all this stuff cold. Then I talked to Colonel James. He was the chief crash investigator for the Air Force for high-speed accidents. So he was like perfect person to talk to. And during his career, he flew the Shooting Star, the P-80, and then the Sabre jets, the 84 and the 86. He was also a U-2 and a SR-71 pilot. So very experienced guy. We had the opportunity to sit in the kitchen of Bill Peterson. He was an engineer that worked for Minneapolis Honeywell, which produces at the time, produced the stability augmentation system for the X-15 and for a number of militaries and now civilian concerns. And this helps to stabilize fly-by-wire flight in aircraft. And lastly, I had some wonderful conversations by phone with Ralph Smith, who has an engineering firm in Tehachapi, not far from Edwards. And he's a world expert on pilot-induced oscillations. And that's something that I wanted to touch on too. So this is my take. We wrote this report. And when I finished with the report, I sent it off to Scott Crossfield and to Bill Dana and to Neil Armstrong, who was the first guy to fly this plane, the number 3 plane. And they all enjoyed it. They recognized I'm a civilian, but they were very encouraging. So when you have an accident, there's something called the Swiss cheese model. So something happens, some specific action or inaction, you forget something on a checklist. Like let's say you've got a checklist and it says lower the landing gear before you land, and you forget, or somebody interrupts you and you forget to do that. Well, you're not necessarily going to crash, right? Because you got a co-pilot and he looks at you and he says, hey, you didn't put down the landing gear. So there are lots of things that happen and don't happen that either didn't get to be too bad or somebody corrected your mistake or whatever. So you have this Swiss cheese model where there are holes, and if all the holes line up, then you're going to have an accident. There's going to be a problem. And so the 4 things that I wanted to look at were the ballistic control system, pilot-induced oscillations, the stability augmentation system, and situational awareness or spatial disorientation. So let's touch on those. So one of the things that we found, if you look over on the right, you can see these things, these little rockets. They don't produce enough power to like push you into orbit, which required, like the Saturn V, would have 1 million pounds of thrust to get you up in orbit. This only produces about 100 pounds of thrust. So it's enough to kind of push the nose around when you're in space. So you think of the space shuttle and it's got, these little rockets on the front of it. It's just to change your attitude in space. Well, over on the left here, you can see this is part of the left wing. And here you can see the ribs. And you can see item L was some of those ribs that we found, and then the tubing that goes to the reaction control jet. And what was interesting when we disassembled it is we noticed that there was an O-ring missing. So if you look up on the top here, this white piece of Teflon there is in one of the lines, but the other one didn't have one. So the last time this thing, and this was all together when we found it. So obviously when somebody last cleaned it or inspected it or, whatever, they didn't put that Teflon ring in. And so that system would have been leaking, or it might not have been operative. I mean, they may have run out of propellant and not been able to orient correctly when it's coming back from space. So that was something that they didn't know in 67. You know, it's something that we found when we were in the desert. The second one is the idea of a pilot-induced oscillation. So aircraft are designed to be stable. If you have a Cessna 172 and you put it into a spin or you do something crazy with it, and then you just kind of let go, it will right itself and it'll be fine, all right? But if you have an interaction between a pilot and an aircraft is trying to do something, a pilot is putting in inputs with the stick, there are situations where that becomes unstable and you get this feedback loop. Like, let's say that like there's a lot of give in the stick. So all of a sudden you're headed towards the ground and you pull back real sharply, but it takes a while for the plane to come back, and then it starts to come back, but it's coming back too much. So you dump the stick forward. What ends up happening is you get this thing called a pilot-induced oscillation, and it's not an uncommon problem with aircraft. So over on the left, you can see the Corsair, the F4U, lots of planes, the F-86, the Century series, the Starfighter, the 104, you know, a whole bunch of planes, the X-15, you know, lots of planes ended up having pilot-induced oscillations, and those can be unrecoverable. So one of the questions was, and we've learned a lot since 67, could that have been a possibility with this crash? And there are different types of PIO. There are actually 3 different types, and it's not really important to get into that. But space shuttle, PIO, over on the right, the flying bathtub, that's the M2F2, PIO, even modern things like, you know, the C-17 in the lower left. I mean, that's designed by computers, you know, built by Boeing. That had PIO as well as the X-15. And PIO is kind of a funny thing. So here are 2 questions. Can aircraft that have passed certification and are generally acceptable, have acceptable handling, you know, qualities, still have PIO? And the answer is they can. So the T-38A, which is the Talon, you know, that it's the advanced trainer for the Air Force, or that the astronauts fly, that had PIO issues, even though it's a very decent plane. By the same token, can you have an aircraft that's very difficult to control? And if that's the case, does that mean that it's PIO prone? And the answer is no. You could have something like, let's take the U-2 reconnaissance plane. The band between stall speed and overspeed is very, very narrow. It needs to fly within like 10 knots of being, you know, where it needs to be. So you have to be an exceptional pilot. And yet it's not giving you these oscillations where you get this unrecoverable interaction between pilot and aircraft. So PIO is its own little deal. And then there's the stability augmentation system. So as aircraft move to fly-by-wire and going faster, there was an interest in having the aircraft, in addition to the pilot, you know, moving the stick, having the aircraft have air data sensors and motion sensors and figure out exactly what was going on, what the wind was doing to the plane, what the pilot was doing with his responses, and to give it a sense, a set of parameters. Say, you know, I don't want it to exceed this bank angle, or I don't want it to pitch up this much, and it would augment the movements by the pilot, and it would smooth some of those things out and make it better to fly, easier to fly. And so this stability augmentation system, in this case from Minneapolis Honeywell, was with the X-15. And when they were using the MH-96, during speed runs, if it popped out, if the circuit breaker popped out, you could just pop the circuit breaker back in, or if it didn't work, you could probably land, or, declare an emergency or something like that. But it was not uncommon to have a problem with that. But when you were doing the ballistic altitude ones, when you went out of the atmosphere and you were coming back from space, if the stability augmentation system went out, you had some real problems. And in this particular flight, it kept cutting in and out. And the thought is that there were transient electrical signals that were coming from one of the experiments out on the wing pod, and that was messing with the stability augmentation system. So it would be working and then not working. And as he's coming back from space, he goes into this hypersonic spin, which is a spin greater than Mach 5, and he's able to straighten this thing out. But then it goes into this terrible like porpoising, and I think the plane beat him to death. And the question is, was the stability augmentation system either actively doing that or not working and keeping that from happening? And that's a real possibility. And lastly, the idea of spatial disorientation. So when you have a Navy pilot that's taking off from a carrier, and they have a catapult and they throw the guy off the carrier, you have this zoom where all of a sudden you're all of the fluid in your inner ear and the little hairs and stuff like that are like going in all kinds of directions, and it takes a couple of seconds for the guy who's come off a carrier to kind of get back to where he's at. So proprioception, or the idea that you have a sense of where your body is, or what which way it's up, and that sort of thing, has to do with your inner ear. And that seat of the pants flying, I feel this amount of gravity in my butt, and that tells me that I'm like going up or going down. And with zoom proprioception, these guys are getting in this rocket ship, and all of a sudden they light this thing and they're going like a V-2 missile. They're going 5-6 times the speed of sound. You can imagine that would be incredibly disorienting. And you don't have a lot of time to catch up, because this thing, the flight may be 10 minutes, okay? But the engine is only running for 60, 70, 80 seconds. So you have to be on top of things, maybe even ahead of things. So they spend a lot of time in a simulator. So where Alan Shepard may have just had a piece of cardboard that he was pointing to in 1960, 1961, these guys actually had, it was an analog, but they had a simulator. They had an X-15 that they would sit in, and as they made inputs, the dials would change, and they had a test conductor who was putting them through different things so they could practice their 10-minute flight 10, 20, 30, 40 times. Now, this is wonderful. Okay, now obviously you don't get the kinds of centrifuge kinds of G-forces that you would get in some of the modern kinds of simulators, but that was great. But in addition to the zoom proprioception, the idea that you couldn't really trust the seat of your pants or your inner ear, and you were kind of confused and dazed, is the idea of the cockpit design being different. So as you got 3 airplanes, number 1, number 2, and number 3. Number 2, after it crashed, they rebuilt it so that it would do the speed flights. And the number 3, they like to do the altitude flights with that one. So the instruments that they would put in these planes, they'd change them out over time. So you can see over on the left, the orientation of the scanning that you would do to look at the different instruments is different than it is on the bottom. Here you can see these tapes for speed and altitude. They were looking at different ways of visually displaying things. So instead of trying to read a little dial and say, well, does that say 40 or 60? Having a tape that showed you you're in the green zone or something like that might be a lot easier for pilots. So they were changing things. So the instruments in the number 1 plane and the number 3 plane might be different, and they may not have caught up to putting the new instrument in the simulator. So here you are, you're flying at 5 times the speed of sound. You've got zoom proprioception issues, right? You can't see. On most airplanes, you look out the window and you can see your wings and you can see where you're going. With this plane, you couldn't see your wings, and you're like pointed up towards space. I mean, there's just a little slit for a window. There really isn't a lot that you can look out. So you can't trust the seat of your pants. You can't really see where you're going. The instruments might be different on different planes. And then what would happen if something goes wrong with the plane? Like the stability augmentation system keeps cutting out, or some of the instruments there's a lag in the instruments. That could be a big problem. And when he re-entered, so he goes ballistic and he gets up to the top of the ballistic arc. And as he comes back, he's yawing. And as he re-enters the atmosphere, he's actually 90 degrees to the direction of flight. And one of the possibilities was that he thought he was lined up with a different instrument, that the instrument that was in that particular plane, or it had been different from in the simulator, that he was flying the wrong axis on one of the instruments. So whether or not it was lagging, or whether or not it was giving him bad information, or whether or not he'd run out of propellant out of his left wing, or, I'm not sure. But these are all possibilities of why the guy crashed. But I want to leave you with this. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew the Atlantic, and he wrote a book called We. And I've thought about that. And when they talk about the Lone Eagle, this was a solo pilot that flew the Atlantic. When he talks about we, where is the accomplishment in that flight? Was the accomplishment the pilot? Well, I mean, certainly there's something about that, right? But it's not just Lindbergh, right? It's also the Spirit of St. Louis. It's that airplane. And it's not just that airplane. It's the Wright Whirlwind engine. They had built an engine, a single engine airplane, where there were no problems with the engine for the 33 hours it took to fly from America to France. So is the accomplishment that engine? Because it couldn't have been done without the engine. Is the accomplishment the aircraft? Is the accomplishment the pilot? Well, it's kind of all of them, right? So when you think of the X-15, we certainly think of the pilots. There were a dozen of them, starting with Crossfield and ending with Bill Dana, and people like Neil Armstrong, who was the first to fly the number 3 aircraft. And when I sent him the crash report, he sent me back that picture on the right, and you can just see that wry smile as he's about to climb into the X-15, and he says, best wishes. But it's all 3 of these things, right? It's the XLR-99, it's the X-15, and it's these marvelous pilots. So what a tremendous program, tremendous legacy, and I was really pleased to have contacted, Crossfield and Dana and Thompson and Armstrong, and it was a wonderful time. And so I leave you with that. Here's a picture looking at at all of the aircraft that they were working on at the same time in NASA. So in the back there, you see the lifting bodies. They were the precursors to the space shuttle, and over on the right are all 3 X-15s. I mean, it must have been an incredible time to be with NASA. So if this is something that you've enjoyed, tell Robert that you want more of this stuff, or if there's something that you want to talk about, please share that with him. And I'd be I'd be happy to come back. Robert, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, David. And to David's point, folks, make sure to fill out that feedback survey I send along with the recording in the email later today. That'll be a great opportunity for you to provide feedback. So if you have any comments for David, please get them into the chat. If you have any questions for David, please get them into the Q&A. We certainly have about 10 minutes or so. JM would like to know, did Major Adams eject and survive?
He did not. Radar altimetry had him, he peaked out at 266,000 feet, which is at 50 miles. And that's just at the edge of space. And when he came back, he went into a hypersonic spin. He was able to control that. But then he started going into this up-down pitch business, porpoising, at about 80,000 feet. And the plane broke apart at 62,000. So he was trying to get it under control, and you know, the distance between the guy's helmet and the top of the inside of the cockpit is probably about an inch. So you know, you can imagine that the guy may have been beat to death. He was certainly you know, trying to get it down on the ground, and the plane, you could eject out of this plane. You could eject going at least Mach 3. I'm not sure quite how fast. But I think he was trying to get it under control, and he might have brought it back. I mean, there were certainly a number of instances where the X-15 had emergency landings, and these very skilled pilots brought it back.
So, David, just to kind of bottom line it for us, Scott asks, in your opinion, what do you think was the cause of the crash?
I think that he re-entered the atmosphere 90 degrees to his flight path, and I think the stability augmentation system, whether it was working or not, I'm not sure, would have been unable to correct for that. I mean, when you see pieces of the plane, it looks like a bomb went off, but it's really just the air that tore the thing apart. So, you know, with the Swiss cheese, you know, maybe it was the MH96, maybe it was the leaky propellant tank on the left. Maybe he was disoriented because of Zoom stuff. It could be a lot of things, but I think my guess is that if the simulator and all three planes had the same instruments in them, it would have been less likely that someone might have actually been trying to fly something that was 90 degrees to the flight path.
Scott also asks, what was the disposition of all the parts that you found?
They're sitting in my attic. Yeah, so that was one of the disappointments about this. I mean, I loved going out there. We interviewed a lot of guys. We took the videotapes, and they got made. There's a guy that does something called spacecraft films, and if you look, he's got one on the X-15, and we put a number of our videos there. With the pieces that we found of the plane, I approached the Smithsonian and said, you know, I'd like you guys to have this stuff, and their response was, we'd be happy to take it, but just know it'll never be seen by anybody. We will simply store it. They said, you know, we're able to show less than 1% of the stuff that we've got, and showing a pile of you know, broken airplane pieces isn't going to be one of them. I tried approaching a number of other museums with the same kind of intent, you know, that if we could create some small little thing to highlight the X-15 and its contributions, that would be great. And when I talked to the Air Force, because, you know, they have a wonderful museum at Wright Pat, the guy says, we have an X-15. Why would we want your pieces? And it's like, okay. I mean, my response is, you know, if you had the Nina and the Pinta, would you want the Santa Maria? I mean, this is the first plane to fly into space. It was first flown by Neil Armstrong. You know, it was the most important technical contributor to the creation of Mercury procedures, Apollo procedures, the space shuttle, energy management stuff. I mean, it was phenomenal. And yet, you know, I mean, that's why I'm doing this, right? Is because I find it interesting, and I want to keep this part of the history alive.
Did your incident report have any different opinions than the original?
No, not really. They weren't terribly conclusive. It was difficult to tell. I mean, they had the radar altimetry stuff. They knew everything about the pilot and about the condition of the plane. Pilot-induced oscillations were not as well known in '67 as they were. There was a landmark study that came out in '77, and then since then, there's been a lot of work that's been done on PIO, and that's a lot better understood. The zoom proprioception, yeah, I mean, that some of that was known. I feel like I put an emphasis on some things that weren't really known at that time, and so for a for an amateur, I'm proud of what we did.
So good segue into our next question. As a result of the publication of your report, what, if anything, changed?
Oh, nothing. What it does, what I hope it does, is it fills in a little bit of history. So I sent it to the Air Force historian. As a matter of fact, it was wonderful. I was in DC, and Dr. Hallion, who wrote Frontiers of Flight, he was introducing me around as Mr. X-15. And I mean, what a delightful thing to say to somebody who, you know, I'm not an author, I'm not a historian, but I'd obviously had this, you know, this passion for it. But the report that I wrote, they put it in a number of libraries, and so I think it helps to present a little bit fuller picture about what happened.
All right, David, we're in the lightning round portion of our Q&A. We've got about, I don't mind staying a few minutes late, David, but we got about 5 minutes.
Okay.
JM asks, do you ever display the pieces you found?
I try to. I'm a solar system ambassador, which means I'm a volunteer with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and I love to go out and give talks. And we were just at a school about a week and a half ago in Brookline in Massachusetts, and this was an elementary school, and it was a STEM night, so science, technology, that kind of stuff. And I brought some pieces of the plane, and kids could pick it up and touch it, and we'd talk about it, and whenever I can pull it out, I do that.
Jane wants to know what happened to the rest of the plane beyond your pieces.
I think it just goes in a junk pile. You know, initially they need it for the accident investigation, but you know, planes crash all the time, and they crashed at Edwards all the time. So it's not something where they say, oh well, this is important, let's keep it. It goes into the dustbin of history.
How many X-15s were built?
There were 3. The first one, which was flown by all 12, is in the Smithsonian. And the number 2, which was the speed flight, that one's in Ohio at the Air Force Museum. And then number 3 is in my attic.
There you go. Enid would like to know, under normal conditions, how difficult was the X-15 to fly as a glider on return to land? Glider, excuse me. Under normal circumstances, how difficult was the X-15 to fly as a glider on return to land?
Well, it's difficult. Okay. First of all, it's going to have very similar characteristics to landing the space shuttle, which they said was like landing a brick. Okay. The lift to drag ratio is very, very small. You can see how small the wings are. When you think of a sailplane, it's got very, very long wings. This one is going to come in really fast, and you have to be ahead of the airplane.
I believe this may be your father or a relative asking, do you remember the first piece you found?
Well, I remember the first piece that was found. It was found by my brother. And so he finds a little piece of the exterior of the plane. And he said that for a moment, just before he picked it up, he was wondering if it was still hot.
Tom would like to know, what issue of Quest was your article in?
Oh, I should figure that out. That was a wonderful magazine, Quest. I think it's still around. I don't know, but I'll tell you what, I will figure that out, and I'll send that information to Robert. And if you get that, it had several good articles on the X-15 on it, not just mine.
Well, David, you've answered 10 questions. I think we have a couple of real quick ones if you want.
Oh, sure.
JM asks, is the Jet Propulsion Laboratory still in Pasadena?
Yes, yes. And they do. So when you think of the Manned Space Flight Center in Houston, that controls manned space flight. But unmanned things like satellites, that's controlled at JPL.
Did the pilot who passed away leave a family behind? Do you know?
He did. And not too many years ago, an Eagle Scout put up a memorial in the desert, and there was a nice ceremony. And if you go to the Kennedy Space Center, there's a mirror that's dedicated to astronauts that have passed away, and one of those astronauts is Mike Adams from the X-15.
All right, David. So let's wrap it there. Folks, let's give David a big virtual round of applause. Look for an email from me later today with the recording and the feedback survey. David, do you have any last words for the audience?
I don't. I'm so pleased that we have such a wonderful participation rate, that people come to listen and to participate, and thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, great turnout, especially with the 80-degree weather today in Massachusetts. Yeah. So thank you all so much. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Enjoy this weather and look for that email. So thanks so much. Have a great one. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Robert.